delighted to be able to speak here for you today. I said to you, Caroline, this morning that it's a very difficult topic to talk about, and it's always kind of important for me to decide where I will talk about these things and where I feel it's a comfortable place to do so. And so I'm very grateful to be here in front of you today. Thank you also for the previous speakers. Just now, Craig was kind of tying us into the relationship between individuals and organizations and how to assign good and bad behavior in that context. And where I will come from is that before we can decide that question, we also need to understand what is good and bad behavior, and we need to understand relationships, and the question is if we always do. And in this modern day, we do really need to understand the digitalized world much better as it is emerging to us, but also as we are looking into that question as we move into the future. And I was very grateful for the comments of my colleague G.P. Singh, who set out to us that we have expected the global south, the developing countries, to follow the same path as we do. You've called it a paternalistic or patronizing approach. And then we have denied the possibility. And there is a great analogy in that with something that we have expected, even put in sort of natural laws, in digitalization. In computer science, there is a law which is called Moore's Law. And this law says that every 18 months, our growth in digitalization will grow exponentially. And so then the expectation is that this law manifests itself in an empirical way everywhere across the globe. And well, I will intend to show that this Moore's law is false, that it doesn't happen in this way, and that a whole lot of other dynamics are at play in our digital or digitalizing world. And I will do that by pointing out to a phenomenon which I will call the black holes in the digital world. And I will illustrate that through the problem of human trafficking. So, in 2009, I kind of stumbled on this new situation that was emerging at that time in the Sinai Desert in Egypt. And in which a completely new modus operandi of human trafficking appeared. I think that we tend to think of human trafficking as trafficking to bring people maybe to Europe in areas of employment where, like prostitution, etc. So for the sake of profit and exploitation in that context. But here, the exploitation was very different. The exploitation here was a forced begging. And the forced begging happened by then, we didn't have these phones then, the very small phones. And the begging happened through the phone to diasporas, to relatives, members of families, everywhere, back home, but also in the United States, in Europe, everywhere. And there is a very important documentary that was made of this phenomena, and it is called Sounds of Torture. And it's a very fitting title, because at that point, you remember, it was the feature phones, we didn't have a smartphone, so the main communication was the voice. And so what is happening here, and what you see in the picture, is that by torturing people at the moment that they were forced to speak to relatives, the sounds of the screams of the people that were tortured were the way in which the pressure was put on relatives to then make payments for ransoms. And these payments for ransoms, they went up very fast. They started in 2009 with a few $100 US, went up very fast, and they went up. I mean, the highest amount that I interviewed was $59,000 US that was asked for ransom for one person. But also people would be sold on and on and on. So many, on average, the ransoms that were paid for the people that were in the end freed, which was also not the case, many did not survive, was on average $36,000 US. So that also shows that it became a very, very lucrative business. So I want to show that the sorry. Now I'm going back. Okay, sorry. This is a picture from the documentary Sounds of Torture, and it's a very heart-wrenching story. You can perhaps see this person talking on the phone to his wife, who is held in Sinai, who has just delivered a baby while she is in chains. And in the documentary, you can just see that he can no longer listen to what he's told by his wife of the situation. And what I wanted to clarify is that as the technology develops, the modus operandi, the way in which this works, also changes. And so what you see here is now, this is already a few years later, this is much more a phone, a smartphone as we have now. So a whole social network emerges within the phone and does a lot of things. It does a lot of social things. These are people that were that died when they were trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea. So it's a memory. It's like our picture books of the past. But also here on the right, a refugee who has reached a certain place and is trying to get to a place of safety and uses the phone as a social network, as a way of connecting. And that has perpetuated here in 2013 in what we could start to see as very much a cycle. This person here, his name is Berhan. He had been severely tortured but survived the situation in the Sinai Desert, had then been imprisoned in Egypt, then had paid again to get out of prison there, even though he was a victim of human trafficking, was then sent back to Ethiopia, then fled from Ethiopia through Sudan and Libya, and then here had crossed over the Mediterranean and had found himself to be on that boat that sank in 2013. Maybe you remember that. And he survived that, and he is walking here on Sicily. So as the technology has evolved, I was saying, these ways in which this business works has also evolved. In about 2014, after the disaster of Lampedusa, there was a whole lot of effort, political effort, put into stopping this situation in Sinai, and it was put to an end during anti-terrorism actions. But what we then saw was also not that surprising, but very sad, is that it has very much spread very quickly. And it's not surprising because it is a very lucrative business model. So at the moment we know and we study the situation in Libya, which has really become among the worst of a similar situation. And again, with the technology, what we know is changing. In the context of Sinai, when we were studying it, we were completely dependent on being able to connect back to the phone, talk to people. But now, obviously, as you can see here on the left, there is WhatsApp, there's social media. This is a message just from a few days ago. I was talking to someone who's held in Libya just now, and I was saying I'm going to speak about this to an audience, so he asked me to greet you. So you can actually really be in touch in real time, which doesn't mean that there's anything that you can do in terms of improving the situation, but you know. And this is a picture that he just sent a few days ago to me to show something of the situation. They are there with 265 people. This particular person, he has already paid 11,000 US, and he has been stuck in different camps, being sold on from place to place 4 times now. And what I want to say before I go to the next slide is that this also means something for us as researchers. When I started to, as I say, I kind of stumbled into this situation in 2009 in the Sinai. It was actually the first time that really there was a global sort of connectivity available, and therefore also this was emerging at in similar ways at different places, in Mexico, at the US border, in Malaysia with Rohingya refugees, and then, as I have been talking about, in the Sinai. And so one of the kids that was there in Sinai was very severely tortured, electrocuted, and who was very ill. He was epileptic. He was only 15 years old, and he was the same age as my son. And it becomes a very difficult situation because it's very real time. And it is very much happening in the moment. So what should you be caring about? And actually at that time, I can say that even my son, he had problems. Relatively, for us, relatively big problems. But now comparing to the situation of this other kid, it was kind of, okay, well, in this case of my son, it was autism. Well, what is autism? It doesn't really matter, It became a very crazy situation in my head. And it was a very difficult situation to just say, okay, I stop this. Because I also, this is now the question of what is moral. Are you allowed to just not care, to put your head, to turn off your head at some point and say, no, now I've done my work, I do something else. So I found this very difficult. And I just want to say that because I think it is something that has come to us in this digital world as a new thing, that we also have to start thinking what it means for our work. And on the next slide, I have a short clip which shows you that now, because now with WhatsApp, you can just send through a small film. So this guy who is in Libya, he can just send me things. And am I going to see them? I'm going to watch them, what I'm going to do with them. So I actually think that it is good to show a little bit of that, but I have to tell you, it's very raw. And I'm always debating with myself, is it even right to show that? But at the same time, that is how it comes into the phones of those who are relatives and whose son or daughter is sending that particular video. And then what do? So I think I will just show a very, very small part of that clip. And if you think it might be too sensitive, then maybe just look away for a small moment. If I can do this. really, sorry. I can't really do it, but I think I can bring across that it's somebody who's being tortured, and it's okay, don't worry. I should have told before, but it doesn't matter. I can describe it. It's somebody who's being tortured. You hear the screams. It's a very awful situation, and you can very well imagine. I think you can empathize with the fact that if this is your child or this is your brother or whatever, that it does really put you in a very difficult situation. Not to help pay somebody get out of that is very difficult, and that is really what is the business model of this this form of human trafficking. So that then begs the question that we need to answer, and that is really, what is happening? How can we explain this? We can know this, but how can we explain this? And what has this to do with the digitalizing world? And for that, I think that I propose that we need to go back to understanding the digital world as a world of what it is, and that is that it facilitates information. And therefore, we have to go back to how the architecture of that information is facilitated. I seem to be fighting with this. The slides that I'm going to show to you now, they are the result of data science. So these are some of the very exciting things that we can also do with this new world of data. And these are large data, and they have been put in a visualization, which means that the maps of where things happen becomes very clear. And in this case, the two researchers, the two colleagues, wanted to see how in this current world we can see the interlocking networks of companies and corporate networks. And so here they have mapped out the location of the largest 1 million firms in the world. And so you see very much a map emerging of the center in Europe and in the west and east part of the United States. And again, here, this is a map of how boards interlock. So you are a member of one company and of the other company. And then again, you see that this is a very centralized world. This picture I have put in, especially the one on the right, because I think it's very important for what I'm going to show afterwards. And that is that the structure of the networks they are contained very much of nodes. They have the centralization at a global context, but then if you go into that, then for instance, well, you see the Netherlands coming up as a very connected part, and the south of the London area, but also you can recognize the German highest economic parts emerging. So this is important in what I'm trying to show. And then here you see on this side, you see the picture that comes up if you look at the nodes from a Facebook perspective, which is very much the same pattern. And then, of course, I think maybe many of you know, this is very much the same pattern if you look at the flights. For instance, now if I would fly from Liberia in West Africa to Nairobi in East Africa, it is faster and cheaper to go through Schiphol or Frankfurt than it is to go across. So the conclusion that my colleagues drew here is that they were saying Africa remains an outlier. And then they are making the observation that here the transnational corporate elite relationship still follow the historic connections of colonization. And that is something that I thought was important and that I wanted to look at a little bit more closely. And so here what you see is what we can see as the origin of the information society. So here you see the roots of the old East Indian Company, the Dutch East Indian Company, and its colonial roots. And so what you see there is quite important even for today. First of all, you see the facilitation of the commerce through routes, sea routes. You also see that they connect to the land in nodes where there are points between, facilitation points between the routes and the land. And of course, in those connecting points, information was collected because these were very expensive endeavors. And so it was very important to know what were threats, what were opportunities, what were possibilities, what were potential liabilities for future plans. And so this information was collected and the information was brought back to the center that we saw still today are emerging as the kind of the corporate center. And that information was very valuable. The Third Anglo-Dutch War was, I don't know if you know that, was actually about a bag of letters that came from these points because they would contain very valuable information. But also with this, a new kind of world emerges. Can I do it? Which is called by scholars the knowledge society, which is that the knowledge is taken out from somewhere, it is analyzed in the center, and then it informs again what we do in other places elsewhere. And so a new kind of time and space dimension emerges. And with that, the engineering of how that architecture works is really informed by the knowledge centers in the center, in the West, and who have a notion that this knowledge is universal, that it can be collected, it can be taken in a way, if you want, out of context and then reassembled and analyzed at a central point, and then inform again the actions within context away from the center. And so this is the current information society, but now this is the digital information society. So these are the sea cables. And then you see that this follows exactly the same structure. The main cables are sea cables. The key elements are the nodes where they connect to the land. And these are our principal places from which we collect information and then bring it back to the centers now as data. Data is the new gold, and where we can can then produce that into information, into knowledge, and set it out. But there are some critical problems here, and those problems I want to set out. The first is that how the sea routes connect to the land is not at all obvious. So what we have seen in Africa is very much a kind of a hotspot, mobile phone-driven connectivity, but the cables generally can't reach inside. And the satellite and broadband-based connectivity is far too expensive for the African context. So also that is not a solution. And then there is another problem, and that is that our knowledge of Africa still remains very limited. We have to remember that the way in which that information structure was built was very much to serve these particular commercial routes. And therefore, the information or the understanding, the knowledge that we had from inside, or even that we have from inside, remains very limited. It was very interesting. A few years ago, I read a document from Frontex, which is protecting our European borders. And they were saying, you know, how it was very successful, and we were stopping the numbers of migrants coming through. And so we needed more material, more money, more technical assistance. And then in a kind of aside to that, it was saying, and also we don't have any information on what is happening on the land. And that was a very shocking thing, because it's kind of, you know, we are zipping this wall, this invisible wall. It's not a Trump wall, but it is nevertheless quite an effective invisible wall. And do we really know what is happening behind that wall? And so one of the things that technically is important, because I'm speaking both from a technical and from a social perspective, something that is technically important is this. The map on the left side is the map that we usually use. It doesn't matter exactly how the measures are, because principally the idea was that we knew the routes. But now for connectivity, the actual surface really matters. So the actual surface, because of course the Earth is a globe, the actual surface is this. And that means that Africa contains the whole of Russia, the whole of the United States, the whole of India, and Europe. That's how big it is. And that means that if you try to connect that with one cable, you have seen that map, right? These many, many cables between Europe and the United States. There's one cable across Africa. It doesn't work. You have one cable, all that information needs to go through. So those cables, they suffer both from latency, which has to do with the distance and the speed of light, how fast that information can go, and congestion. And when you have the combination, it just gets stuck. So it can't connect. And then I have to come back one time more to the economic aspect of it, because already I have indicated at the very beginning that there is this commoditization of human beings as part of this new economic model. And again, I wanted to make the point that this is also something that is not new. This is also something in which we have a history, and this social phenomenon is built on that history. So I'm going to come to a conclusion now slowly. What I want to propose is that the digitalizing world does not have universal effects, and it is not universally good. And what we need to recognize is that within that digital world, there are a lot of places that cannot be reached, or at least cannot be reached in the same terms as in which we are using daily our phone. And so in these black holes where you basically don't have connectivity, people still know that there is connectivity out there. So they still want to connect. So how do you do that? So that becomes a social process, because then you have people. You have people who are in a city who come back. They say, this is what is possible outside. You have people within those, what I have called black holes, who are through those facilitators relating to that outside world. And that is often a beginning point of human trafficking, because you need to pay for that. You need that facilitation has a price. And so as soon as you kind of want to connect from within those places to places that are slightly better connected, then the facilitation of that mobility starts to appear, but also that dependency. And that is also where the question of what is good and bad becomes a very difficult question, because at that point, those people who are the facilitators are often not seen as bad people. They are actually doing something that people want, because they want to be connected. And they want to be connected for different reasons, but they put their trust in those that are the interlocutors. This is still an important slide, because it links to what we were discussing last night, what Timothy Snyder was saying, that this is all very much still a legacy of the imperialistic structure that we come from in our relationship between Europe and Africa. And therefore, the reality is, I've already said, in the knowledge of inside Africa, we didn't really have at that time, and it wasn't our interest. So when we put the borders there, the borders were there to indicate what part was British, what part was French, what part was Dutch, what part was German. They had nothing to do with the governance. So now today, if we are saying, okay, we have this problem around digitalization, but these countries are responsible for solving it, then I would say that that is very difficult, because digitalization is already a global, very interconnected process, and the nation state in Africa has never had the sovereignty in coming from a historical perspective in which it was rooted. And therefore, really, the governments in Africa don't have the means or the power to deal with this. And I'm now going to skip some slides, because I think that I'm probably going over my time. I just want to conclude with this last slide. This is a kid that is sitting in a camp in northern Ethiopia. That camp is not connected. Why is it not connected? Because it's considered a security problem. The connection is considered a security problem. Are the kids connected? They connect. How do they connect? Well, one of the things is that they climb a mountain and they wave their phone, and so they somehow pick up a little bit of connectivity. They draw Facebook down. They send their messages to their relatives, go back on the hill, and get a little bit of connectivity. But they are very ingenious. They also have incredible other ways of connecting. For instance, one of the things that we found out was that they dial a security number, a European security number, like 112. Of course, it doesn't give them any response, but what it does give them is a moment of connectivity through the satellite in which they can draw down this little Facebook, can communicate some small thing out, and again, they go out. It's very difficult to do, and it's very costly in terms of your energy and your time. So what you are going to put out is only going to be to the people that you trust most and that are dearest to you. So are they going to go on a website of UNHCR or IOM or whatever to see what they should do? Of course they don't. The only thing that they trust is those that are facilitating, those that are within and among their relatives, and those that they can reach quickly through these means of social media. And that is the new reality. Are their phones very useful for them? Well, it connects them back to people who have increasingly become very shattered, partly in search for connectivity that then can support, they think or they hope or they believe, a better economic prospect. And then many come in the hands of hardcore human traffickers and leading to the situation in Libya that I started with. So with that, I want to finish, but I still owe it to you, I think, to answer that question. You know, where does this leave us now in terms of our responsibility? the one thing that I would say is that that responsibility has to start with care. We have to care in order to know, and we also have to care in order to care about this situation, to do something about this situation. And the one difficulty that we have is that we think that in the digital world we know and we see everything. And I would suggest that actually it makes it sometimes much more difficult for us to see those things, partly because we are so blinded by thinking that we can see everything. So I hope that I have been able to give a little bit of a different perspective in how the relationship emerged, at least in my research, between this digitalizing world and the problems that it poses for many people who are trapped within this terrible condition of human trafficking. Thank you.